Some bonds refuse to break, even when death tries to sever them. Some love refuses to abandon, even when the living choose to walk away. This is a story that exists in the space between grief and mystery, between what we can explain and what we can only feel. It's about a man named Daniel Harper who made a choice in his darkest moment, a choice to remove every reminder of his late wife, including the elderly calico cat she cherished like a child. It's about a decision made in pain that would return as something far more haunting. And it's about what happened when, exactly 31 days after he abandoned that cat at a rural shelter, Daniel checked his infant son's baby monitor at 2 in the morning and saw amber eyes glowing in the darkness of the nursery. Eyes that belonged to a cat that should have been impossible to find, impossible to enter, impossible to be there at all. This is not just a ghost story. This is a story about the debts we owe to those we've loved, the guardians we dismiss, and the truth that some protectors will return from beyond comprehension itself to fulfill promises the living have forgotten. Sarah Harper died on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks after giving birth to their son, Eli. The cause was a pulmonary embolism, sudden, catastrophic, a blood clot that traveled from her leg to her lungs while she slept. Daniel woke that morning to find his wife cold beside him, their infant son crying in the nursery, and his entire world transformed into something unrecognizable and impossibly cruel. The funeral was a blur of condolences he couldn't absorb, and casseroles he couldn't eat. Family descended. Sarah's mother stayed for 2 weeks, his sister for another. But eventually, everyone returned to their lives, their own grief manageable because Sarah hadn't been the center of their universe. For Daniel, there was no returning. There was only the nursery where Eli cried, the bed where Sarah had died, and the relentless, suffocating awareness that he was now solely responsible for keeping a 3-week-old infant alive when he could barely remember to breathe. And there was Maisie, the cat, a 14-year-old calico that Sarah had adopted in college, long before Daniel entered her life. Maisie had been Sarah's constant companion through graduate school, career changes, their courtship, their wedding, the pregnancy. Sarah talked to that cat like she was a person, called her "my first baby," made Daniel laugh by insisting Maisie understood complex emotional concepts. Daniel had tolerated Maisie. He wasn't cruel to her, but he'd never understood Sarah's depth of attachment. She was just a cat, aloof, particular about being touched, inclined to knock things off counters and vomit on carpets at inconvenient times. But Sarah loved her with an intensity that bordered on irrational. So Daniel accepted Maisie as part of the package deal of loving his wife. After Sarah died, Maisie's behavior changed. The cat, who had always maintained dignified distance, began following Daniel everywhere. She sat outside the bathroom while he showered. She positioned herself at the nursery door while he fed Eli. Most unsettling, she began sleeping on Sarah's side of the bed, pressed against the exact spot where Sarah's body had been found. Daniel found it unbearable. Every time he saw Maisie, he saw Sarah holding her, heard Sarah's voice doing that ridiculous baby talk she reserved for the cat. Maisie wasn't just a reminder of his wife. She was a living monument to everything he'd lost, a furry embodiment of grief that followed him through rooms still saturated with Sarah's absence. 3 weeks after the funeral, Daniel's mother visited and found him in the nursery at 4 in the morning, Eli finally asleep in his arms, tears streaming down Daniel's face, while Maisie sat in the doorway watching with those unblinking amber eyes. "You can't keep doing this," his mother said gently. "You need to focus on your son. You need to let some things go." That night, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't change that Sarah was gone. He couldn't bring her back or undo the cosmic injustice of a 31-year-old woman dying just as her life's greatest joy had begun. But he could control his environment. He could remove the things that made grief physically painful to encounter. He could create space to breathe. He started with Sarah's clothes, packing them into boxes for donation. Then her toiletries, her books, the artwork she'd collected. He moved through the house like a man performing surgery on his own life, excising anything that held too much of her presence. And when he finished, only one reminder remained. Maisie, watching him from the hallway with those amber eyes that seemed to hold accusation. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered to the cat, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. "I just can't. I can't do this." Maisie blinked slowly, a gesture Sarah had always insisted meant "I love you" in cat language. Daniel looked away, unable to hold that gaze. The next morning, he called a no-kill shelter 40 miles outside the city, far enough that he wouldn't accidentally encounter Maisie in a local adoption posting, close enough that he could tell himself he'd done the responsible thing. He explained the situation. Elderly cat, owner deceased, new father overwhelmed. They had space, they would take her. Daniel placed Maisie in the carrier Sarah had used for vet visits. The cat didn't fight, didn't cry out. She simply looked at him through the metal grate with those amber eyes, and Daniel felt something crack in his chest that he refused to examine too closely. He drove the 40 miles in silence, handed over the carrier and the medical records, signed the surrender forms, and drove home. That night, the house felt different. Quieter, which was what he'd wanted. Empty, which he told himself was necessary. He fed Eli, put him down in the crib, and checked the baby monitor, a modern device with a camera that transmitted to his phone, infrared for night vision, motion detection, the works. The screen showed his son sleeping peacefully in the darkness, illuminated by gentle green light. No cat in the doorway, no amber eyes watching, just an infant, breathing steadily, unaware that half his family was gone and the other half was barely holding on. Daniel exhaled slowly and tried to feel relief. It would be exactly 31 days before he understood what he'd done, before he learned that some bonds cannot be broken by distance or surrender forms, before he discovered that love, when fierce enough, finds ways to transcend the boundaries we think separate the living from the lost. Grief, Daniel learned, was not a linear process, but a landscape. Sometimes he could navigate it, sometimes it swallowed him whole. He developed routines because routines were survivable. Wake at 6 when Eli cried, change diaper, warm bottle, feed while staring at nothing. Nap when the baby napped. Repeat every 3 hours until consciousness blurred into semi-consciousness and night became indistinguishable from day. His sister Rebecca visited weekly, bringing groceries and concern. "You look terrible," she said with the bluntness of siblings. "When did you last shower?" Daniel couldn't remember. Time had become measured in feeding schedules and diaper changes, not days or hygiene. Rebecca stayed to help, holding Eli while Daniel stood under hot water and tried to remember who he'd been before grief rewrote his identity. "You should join a support group," Rebecca suggested. "There are groups for young widowers, for single parents." Daniel nodded without commitment. The idea of sitting in a circle talking about loss felt impossible. His grief wasn't something to share. It was something to survive, to outlast, to hopefully wake up one morning and find it had loosened its grip enough that he could breathe again. The house still held Sarah everywhere. Her coffee mug in the cabinet he couldn't bring himself to use, the dent in the couch cushion where she'd nested during late pregnancy, the nursery she'd decorated with such joy, yellow walls because they'd wanted to be surprised by Eli's sex, hand-painted woodland creatures, a rocking chair where she'd planned to nurse and sing lullabies. Daniel fed Eli in that chair now, but he never sang. He couldn't carry melodies without hearing Sarah's voice harmonizing. Maisie's absence should have been a relief. No more litter box, no more cat hair on dark clothes, no more living reminder of everything he'd lost. But Daniel found himself noticing the spaces where she'd been, the window perch where she'd sunbathed, the corner of the couch she'd claimed, the spot outside the nursery door where she'd stationed herself like a guardian. The emptiness he'd created didn't feel like freedom. It felt like another loss stacked atop loss until he wasn't sure what remained of his life except absence and obligation. Eli, at least, was thriving. The pediatrician confirmed he was gaining weight appropriately, meeting developmental milestones, showing no signs of distress beyond normal infant fussiness. "You're doing a good job," the doctor said, and Daniel wanted to laugh at the absurdity. He wasn't doing a good job. He was barely doing anything except keeping a tiny human alive through sheer stubborn refusal to fail at the one thing Sarah had entrusted to him. At night, Daniel relied on the baby monitor obsessively. He kept his phone beside the bed, volume up, checking it every time Eli stirred. The camera provided a strange comfort. He could watch his son breathe, confirm he was safe without entering the nursery and risking waking him. Modern parenting, facilitated by technology and anxiety. Sometimes, in that space between waking and sleeping, Daniel imagined he saw movement on the monitor. Shadows that shifted wrong, the sense of presence in an empty room. But when he looked directly, there was only Eli in his crib. The mobile Sarah had hung casting gentle rotating shadows, the nightlight providing ambient glow. Grief hallucinations probably, the mind conjuring phantoms from exhaustion and loss. 3 weeks after surrendering Maisie, Daniel dreamed of Sarah. She was in the nursery holding Eli, humming the lullaby she'd sung throughout her pregnancy. She looked up at Daniel with an expression of such profound sadness that he woke with tears already streaming down his face. He grabbed his phone, checked the monitor. Eli slept peacefully, alone. But for just a moment, Daniel could have sworn he saw something at the edge of the frame, something small and four-legged, positioned exactly where Maisie used to sit. He blinked. The shape was gone, or had never been there. He set the phone down and stared at the ceiling until dawn, wondering if there was a finite amount of grief a human could endure before the mind simply shattered under the weight of it. The answer, he suspected, was no. Grief didn't shatter you. It transformed you into someone who carried breaking as a permanent condition, fractures that knitted incorrectly and ached with every breath, but somehow, impossibly, still held together. Daniel got up to feed Eli, started another day identical to the one before, and told himself this was healing. This was moving forward. This was what survival looked like when everything worth living for had been taken except the tiny, demanding miracle in the nursery that needed him to keep going. He didn't know that in 11 days, survival would become insufficient. In 11 days, the ordinary haunting of grief would become something far more literal. In 11 days, he would learn that he hadn't just abandoned a cat. He'd dismissed a guardian, and guardians, especially those bound by promises to the dead, don't abandon their posts just because the living no longer want them there. The number had no particular significance. 31 days since Daniel had surrendered Maisie to the shelter. 31 days since he'd looked into those amber eyes and driven away. Just over a month, enough time that he'd stopped automatically filling her food bowl in the mornings, stopped listening for the soft thump of her jumping onto the bed at night. Grief over losing Maisie had been absorbed into the larger grief of losing Sarah. One more absence in a life defined by what was missing. Eli was 8 weeks old now, beginning to make eye contact and produce sounds that weren't quite coos, but weren't just reflexive noise either. The pediatrician called them proto-communication, and Daniel found himself talking to his son more, narrating diaper changes and feedings like Sarah had planned to do. "Okay, buddy, let's get you changed. Yes, I know, cold wipes are terrible. You're very brave, just like your mom." That last part slipped out sometimes. References to Sarah, comparisons to her expressions or mannerisms Daniel thought he saw emerging in their son's face. He wasn't sure if talking to Eli about his mother was healthy or harmful, if it preserved her memory or burdened an infant with grief too heavy for such small shoulders to carry. He did it anyway, because the alternative was letting Sarah disappear from the world entirely, and that felt like the greater cruelty. Rebecca had convinced him to join an online support group for widowed parents. Daniel lurked mostly, reading others' stories, but rarely contributing. The grief there was universal. Young parents whose partners had died from cancer, accidents, complications of childbirth, sudden medical events that turned ordinary days into catastrophes. Everyone described the same surreal sensation, the world continuing as if nothing had changed while their personal universe had ended. One woman wrote about seeing her late husband in dreams, conversations so vivid she woke expecting him to be there. Another described finding her deceased wife's handwriting in unexpected places, a grocery list, a note in a book, and the physical pain of encountering these fragments. Daniel recognized his own experience in their words, the ordinary haunting of loss, the way the dead lingered, not through supernatural means, but through the thousand small spaces they'd once occupied. That night, day 31, though Daniel wasn't counting, he put Eli down at 7 and collapsed into bed by 8, exhausted from a day of crying jags and feeding struggles. He set his phone on the nightstand, baby monitor app open, and was asleep before he could ruminate on anything. Deep sleep, dreamless, the kind his body craved after weeks of fragmented rest. He woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of Eli fussing. Not crying yet, but making those preliminary noises that meant he'd wake himself fully in about 3 minutes, and then Daniel would need to feed him. Daniel grabbed his phone, squinting at the bright screen in the darkness, pulling up the monitor feed to assess whether Eli was truly waking or might settle himself. The image loaded, infrared night vision rendering the nursery in shades of green and black. Eli was stirring in his crib, arms waving in that uncoordinated newborn fashion. The mobile turned slowly overhead. The nightlight glowed gently, and there at the foot of the crib were 2 amber eyes reflecting the camera's infrared light with an unmistakable animal shine. Daniel's breath stopped. He stared at the screen, waiting for the image to resolve into something explainable. A trick of light, a reflection, a glitch in the camera. But the eyes remained, unblinking, positioned at exactly the height where a cat sitting upright would be. As he watched, the eyes moved slightly, the head tilting in a gesture so familiar it sent ice through Daniel's veins. He was out of bed and running down the hall before conscious thought caught up with instinct. He burst into the nursery, hand fumbling for the light switch. The overhead lights blazed to life. Eli startled at the sudden brightness and began crying. Daniel scanned the room frantically, under the crib, behind the rocking chair, in the corners, the closet. Nothing, no cat. No animal of any kind, just an infant screaming his displeasure at being jolted awake. Daniel picked up Eli, heart hammering, and checked every inch of the nursery. The window was closed and locked. The door had been shut. He always kept it shut, had installed a handle cover specifically so no animals could push it open. There was no way for a cat to have entered the room, no way for a cat to have been there at all. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, pulled up the monitor app, and replayed the last few minutes of footage. There, at 2:17:13, the amber eyes appeared at the foot of the crib. They remained visible for approximately 43 seconds. Moving slightly, blinking once, then, at 2:17:56, exactly 4 seconds before Daniel entered the room, they simply vanished. Not a cat walking away, not movement out of frame. The eyes were there, and then they weren't, as if someone had switched them off. Daniel sat in the rocking chair, Eli fussing against his shoulder, and tried to apply logic to something that violated every rational framework. Possible explanations cycled through his mind. Camera malfunction, reflection from some external light source, a hallucination, his exhausted brain projecting wishes or fears onto ambiguous visual data. All were more plausible than the alternative his hindbrain kept insisting on, that Maisie had somehow returned, that the cat he'd abandoned 40 miles away had found her way back and was in the nursery, watching over Eli. Impossible. Cats didn't teleport. They didn't pass through locked doors and closed windows. They didn't appear and disappear like digital glitches. This was grief, Daniel told himself. Grief and exhaustion creating phantoms from guilty conscience and sleeplessness. He'd been dreaming and incorporated the monitor feed into the dream logic. That was all. He fed Eli, put him back down and checked the entire house. Every door, every window, every possible entry point, all secured. He searched closets and under furniture, knowing it was irrational but needing to confirm. No cat. Of course, no cat. Maisie was at a shelter 40 miles away. Had probably been adopted weeks ago by someone who would love her properly, give her a home that wasn't saturated with grief and loss. Daniel returned to bed at 3:30 but didn't sleep. He kept the monitor feed open, watching Eli breathe, waiting for amber eyes to reappear in the darkness. They didn't. The rest of the night passed without incident. By morning, the whole episode had taken on the quality of a dream, vivid but ultimately unreal, significant only in what it revealed about his mental state. Rebecca called at 10, their weekly check-in. Daniel almost told her about the monitor incident, but stopped himself. How would he explain without sounding unhinged? "I think I saw Sarah's dead cat on the baby monitor, even though the cat is 40 miles away, and there's no way it could have gotten into a locked room." She'd insist he see a therapist, maybe suggest he wasn't capable of caring for Eli alone. Better to keep it private, file it away as a weird moment and move on. But that night, when he put Eli down and checked the monitor before bed, some part of him waited, watched, almost hoped. Because if Maisie was somehow there, impossible as it seemed, it meant something of Sarah remained accessible. It meant the wall between the living and the lost wasn't quite as absolute as it appeared. The monitor showed only Eli, sleeping peacefully. Daniel told himself he was relieved. He was lying. Daniel spent the next 3 days convincing himself it had been a technical glitch. Modern technology malfunctioned constantly. Apps crashed, cameras froze, infrared sensors produced artifacts. The amber eyes on the monitor were probably lens flare, or a reflection from a passing car's headlights filtered through the window in some strange way. Perfectly explainable if he just accepted the most rational explanation, instead of spiraling into supernatural thinking. But on the 4th night, it happened again. Same time, 2:17 a.m., as if whatever this was operated on a precise schedule. Daniel woke seconds before the monitor alert and grabbed his phone, already knowing what he'd see. There, rendered in infrared green, sat a cat-shaped silhouette at the foot of Eli's crib. Amber eyes reflecting the camera with unmistakable clarity. This time, Daniel didn't run to the nursery. He watched. The cat, because denying what he was seeing had become impossible, sat perfectly still, gaze fixed on the sleeping infant. After approximately 30 seconds, the head turned slightly toward the camera, as if aware of being observed. The eyes held Daniel's through the screen, and he felt something pass between them, recognition perhaps, or accusation, or something more complex than words could capture. Then, as before, the image simply vanished. Not a cat walking away, but there one moment and gone the next, like someone had deleted it from reality. Daniel immediately opened the nursery door. He'd left it ajar this time specifically to test whether a physical cat could be present. Eli slept undisturbed. The room was empty. No warmth where a cat had been sitting, no disturbed air, no evidence of any physical presence. Daniel sat at his computer until dawn, researching. He found forums for paranormal enthusiasts discussing animal spirits, Reddit threads about pets appearing after death, YouTube videos claiming to show ghost cats on security cameras. Most were obvious hoaxes or misidentified reflections, but some, a small percentage, resembled what he was experiencing. Consistent timing, specific locations, appearance on digital monitoring equipment, but not to the naked eye. One forum post caught his attention. A woman describing how her deceased dog appeared on her baby monitor for 6 weeks after its death, always positioned protectively near her newborn's crib. She'd been terrified initially, then consulted a medium who told her the dog was fulfilling a promise it had made to watch over the child. When the baby was old enough to no longer need constant monitoring, the appearances stopped. Daniel closed the browser tab, feeling ridiculous. He didn't believe in mediums or animal spirits or promises that transcended death. He believed in neurons and grief hallucinations and camera malfunctions. But belief, he was learning, was a luxury of certainty, and he wasn't certain of anything anymore except that something was appearing on his baby monitor and that something looked exactly like Maisie. He called the shelter that afternoon, telling himself he just needed confirmation that Maisie was still there, physically accounted for in the real world. The shelter worker put him on hold, returned 3 minutes later with news that made Daniel's stomach drop. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harper. Maisie was adopted 2 weeks ago by a family in Connecticut. We can't release their contact information due to privacy policies, but I can confirm she's in a good home." Connecticut, at least 3 hours away. Even if Maisie had somehow escaped, which was unlikely from a responsible adoptive family, she couldn't be simultaneously in Connecticut and appearing in his nursery, unless the thing on the monitor wasn't actually Maisie, wasn't actually physical, was something else entirely. That night, Daniel set up his laptop in the nursery with recording software running continuously. If the camera was glitching, he'd capture it from multiple angles and prove this was technical rather than supernatural. He positioned the laptop to record both the crib and the spot where the cat shape appeared, then returned to his bedroom with the monitor feed on his phone. At 2:17 a.m., right on schedule, the amber eyes appeared on his phone screen. Daniel held his breath, waiting. The eyes remained for 42 seconds. He counted, then vanished. He immediately grabbed the laptop and reviewed the footage. The laptop's camera, pointed at the exact same spot from a different angle, showed nothing. No cat, no eyes, no anomaly of any kind. Just empty floor space at the foot of the crib. The baby monitor camera saw something the laptop camera didn't. Same room, same moment, different results. Daniel sat in the dark nursery, Eli sleeping peacefully, and felt the last of his rational explanations crumble. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't grief hallucination. This was something appearing specifically on the baby monitor, something that wanted to be seen, but only through that particular lens. He thought of Sarah's beliefs, the spiritual framework she'd held that he'd always gently dismissed. She'd believed animals had souls, that love persisted beyond death, that the universe was more mysterious than materialism allowed. She'd promised Maisie, half joking but with an undercurrent of seriousness, that she'd always take care of her, that they'd never be separated. Had she made similar promises about Eli, about watching over their son no matter what? Daniel opened the photo album on his phone, found a picture of Sarah from late pregnancy, sitting in the rocking chair with Maisie on her lap. Both were looking at the camera, Sarah's hand resting on her swollen belly, Maisie's expression serene. "You protect each other," Sarah had said when Daniel took that photo. "My 3 babies." He'd laughed, but she'd been serious. He could see it in her face, the fierce protectiveness that radiated from her. What if Maisie wasn't haunting him? What if she was keeping a promise? What if Sarah, unable to be there herself, had somehow sent or enabled the cat she'd loved to stand guard over the child she'd died protecting? It sounded insane. It violated everything Daniel understood about reality. But insane or not, something was in that nursery every night at 2:17, watching over his son with amber eyes that he'd recognize anywhere. The question wasn't whether this was really happening. The question was what Daniel was supposed to do about it. Daniel stopped trying to explain it away. The cat, Maisie's spirit manifestation, whatever terminology made it mentally manageable, appeared on the baby monitor every night at 2:17 a.m. and remained for approximately 40 seconds before vanishing. The pattern was absolute, the timing precise, the appearance consistent. Fighting against it felt increasingly futile, like arguing with gravity or insisting the sun shouldn't rise. He began documenting the appearances methodically: date, time, duration, Eli's state during the manifestation. A scientist studying an impossible phenomenon, collecting data, even when the data defied every framework he'd built his understanding of reality upon. Eli was always calm during the appearances, often sleeping but sometimes awake and content, never distressed. Whatever Maisie's presence was, it didn't frighten the infant. Rebecca visited and found Daniel watching the monitor feed with unusual intensity. "What are you looking at?" she asked. He almost told her everything, but the words died in his throat. How could he explain without sounding delusional? "Just checking on him," he said instead, which wasn't entirely a lie. Rebecca looked at him with concern, but didn't press. Daniel started talking to the cat on the monitor. It felt absurd at first, speaking to a digital image of something that might be supernatural, or might be his mind fracturing under prolonged grief, but absurdity no longer mattered. "Are you really there?" he whispered at 2:17 one morning, watching the amber eyes on the screen. "Is this really happening?" The cat shape tilted its head, the gesture so perfectly Maisie that Daniel felt tears burn his eyes. "I'm sorry I left you at the shelter," he continued, voice breaking. "I couldn't look at you without seeing her. I couldn't carry both of you, the grief and the reminder. I know that's selfish. I know you didn't deserve that." The eyes blinked slowly. Once, the gesture Sarah had always insisted meant feline forgiveness. Daniel wanted desperately to believe that's what it meant now. The appearances continued nightly, but Daniel's relationship to them transformed. What had been terrifying became comforting. He began waiting for 2:17, taking solace in the consistency of Maisie's vigil. She was there when he couldn't be, watching over Eli with the devotion she'd once shown Sarah. A guardian, transcending whatever boundary separated the living from the lost. One night, Eli woke feverish and fussy, his first illness. Daniel spent hours trying to soothe him, checking temperature, debating whether to call the pediatric nurse line or go to the ER. At 2:17, Maisie appeared as always, but this time, instead of sitting still, the cat shape moved, circling the crib once before settling in a different position, closer to where Eli's head rested. Daniel watched, transfixed, as Eli, who'd been crying for an hour, suddenly quieted and fell asleep. Coincidence, possibly. Or possibly something more, a calming presence, a spiritual sedative, the touch of something that loved him, channeled through a cat who'd promised to protect. Daniel didn't know. But Eli's fever broke by morning, and Daniel found himself whispering thanks to the empty nursery, to whatever listened, to Maisie or Sarah or the universe that had somehow bent itself to provide this small mercy. He researched more, finding scattered accounts of similar phenomena, pets appearing after death to vulnerable family members, particularly children or the grieving. Some parapsychologists theorized that intense love created energetic imprints. The consciousness could persist in localized ways when strong enough attachment existed. Others suggested the living unconsciously manifested apparitions from desperate need for comfort and continuity. Daniel didn't care about theoretical frameworks. He cared that every night something that looked and moved like Maisie appeared to watch over his son. Whether that something was truly the cat spirit or his own psyche creating protective symbolism mattered less than the fact that it helped. It made the darkness of 2 a.m. feedings less isolating. It made him feel less alone in the enormous responsibility of keeping Eli safe and alive. Rebecca finally confronted him directly. "You're different lately. Calmer maybe, but also strange. Like you're waiting for something or listening to something no one else can hear." Daniel considered lying again, then decided he was too tired for deception. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked. Rebecca frowned. "Why?" Daniel showed her the monitor footage. The amber eyes appearing and disappearing explained the nightly pattern. Rebecca watched silently, her expression cycling through skepticism to confusion to something softer. "That's Maisie," she said finally. Not a question, a statement. She'd known the cat for years, through family gatherings, had seen the bond between Sarah and that animal. "How is that possible?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know, but it's happening, every night. And I think Sarah sent her to watch over Eli, to keep the promise she couldn't keep herself." Rebecca was quiet for a long time. Then, "Sarah loved that cat, and she loved Eli more than anything. If anyone could figure out how to protect her baby from beyond death, it would be her." She looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "Maybe you shouldn't have given Maisie away, but maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe love is stronger than whatever you or I understand about how reality works." That night, when Maisie appeared at 2:17, both Daniel and Rebecca watched on the monitor. The amber eyes gazed at Eli, then, impossibly, seemed to look directly at the camera, at them. Rebecca gasped. "She knows we're watching." Daniel nodded. "She always knows." They sat together in the darkness, two people watching a supernatural cat guard an infant, and somehow it felt less like horror and more like grace. 3 months after Maisie's first appearance on the monitor, Eli began sleeping through the night. The pediatrician celebrated this milestone. Most infants didn't achieve consistent sleep patterns until 4 or 5 months, but Eli was ahead of schedule. Daniel accepted congratulations, while privately wondering if Maisie's nightly presence contributed to his son's unusual calm. Some questions had no provable answers. The appearances continued with clockwork precision. 2:17 a.m., 40 seconds. Amber eyes watching. Daniel had stopped being frightened and graduated to something approaching gratitude. He'd researched enough to understand that most supernatural experiences were temporary, that spirits or manifestations or whatever this was eventually moved on. He dreaded the night when 2:17 would arrive and the monitor would show only an empty nursery. Rebecca had become his confidant in this impossible experience. She visited weekly, sometimes staying until after 2:17 so they could witness Maisie together. She'd researched too, found books about animal consciousness and theories about love persisting beyond death. "You know what I think," she said one evening. "I think Sarah is okay. I think Maisie being here means Sarah found peace, that she's able to still protect Eli even though she can't be here physically." Daniel wanted to believe that, wanted to think that somewhere in whatever came after, Sarah knew her son was safe and growing and loved. That she could see him even if he couldn't see her. That Maisie's vigil was a message from his wife. "I'm still here, I'm still watching, you're not alone in this." On a Tuesday in late June, exactly 4 months since Sarah's death, something changed. Daniel woke at 2:17 as usual, checked the monitor, and saw Maisie in her customary spot. But this time, the cat didn't just sit and watch. The image moved, walking around the crib in a slow circle, then stopping directly in front of the camera. The amber eyes filled the screen, closer than they'd ever been, staring with such intensity that Daniel felt pinned by the gaze. Then Maisie did something she'd never done before. She opened her mouth. Daniel could see it clearly on the monitor, and though no sound transmitted through the camera, he heard it, not with his ears but with something deeper, a single word in Sarah's voice, clear, as if she were standing beside him. "Together." Daniel sat frozen, phone trembling in his hands. The image of Maisie held for 5 seconds longer than usual, then vanished. He ran to the nursery, threw open the door, expecting what? He didn't know. But the room was empty except for Eli, sleeping peacefully, a small smile on his infant face, as if he were dreaming something pleasant. "Together," Daniel whispered to the darkness. What did it mean? Together as in Sarah and Maisie were together wherever spirits went. Together as in he and Eli would be okay. Together as in everyone he'd lost was somehow still connected to everyone who remained. The word echoed in his mind, carrying weight he couldn't quite pass. He called Rebecca at 2:30 a.m., not caring about the hour. She spoke, he said without preamble. Maisie, or Sarah through Maisie. She said, together. Rebecca was quiet, processing. Then, what do you think it means? Daniel exhaled slowly. I think it means I need to stop treating death like it's the end of connection. I think it means Sarah is still part of our lives even though she's gone. And I think... His voice broke. I think it means I'm forgiven for giving Maisie away. The next morning, Daniel drove the 40 miles to the shelter where he'd surrendered Maisie. He explained the situation to a different worker than he'd originally dealt with, asked if there was any way to get contact information for the family who'd adopted her. The worker was sympathetic but firm. Privacy policies prevented sharing adopter information, but if Daniel wanted to leave a message, they could forward it. Daniel wrote a letter to people he'd never meet about a cat they probably loved, explaining that she'd been his late wife's companion and he'd made a mistake in surrendering her. He didn't mention the supernatural appearances. That would sound unhinged. He simply asked if they might send a photo, proof that Maisie was happy and well cared for. He left his email address and drove home expecting nothing. 3 days later, he received a response. The family who'd adopted Maisie wrote that she was indeed thriving, had bonded especially with their 8-year-old daughter who'd been lonely and struggling. They included photos. Maisie looking healthier than Daniel had ever seen her, her coat groomed and shining, her amber eyes bright. She slept on the daughter's bed every night, they wrote. She was a comfort and a blessing. Daniel stared at the photos and felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight since Sarah's death. Maisie was alive and well in Connecticut, which meant the presence on the baby monitor wasn't the physical cat, but something else. Spirit, manifestation, love given form through whatever mechanism allowed such things. Not Maisie herself, but Maisie's essence, or Sarah's love channeled through the shape of the cat she'd cherished. He responded to the email thanking them, explaining that knowing Maisie was happy gave him peace. He didn't need to tell them about the nightly appearances. That was between him, Sarah, and whatever force allowed the dead to keep promises to the living. He could let the physical cat live her remaining years in comfort while still receiving the spiritual protection she offered. That night at 2:17, Maisie appeared as always. But Daniel saw her differently now, not as a haunting or a glitch or even a supernatural phenomenon, but as a gift, a bridge between the life he'd lost and the life he was building. A reminder that love didn't end just because hearts stopped beating, that the bonds we forge persist in ways science couldn't measure, but experience could confirm. Thank you, Daniel whispered to the amber eyes on the screen, for watching over him, for keeping your promise, for showing me that she's still here in the ways that matter. The cat blinked slowly, and Daniel could have sworn he saw Sarah's smile in that gesture, her approval, her eternal fierce love for the child she died protecting. Eli's 6-month pediatric checkup arrived with assessments and milestones. He was ahead of developmental curves, strong neck control, good eye tracking, beginning to sit with support. The doctor remarked on his calm temperament, his easy disposition. "You're doing an excellent job," she told Daniel. "Single-parenting an infant while grieving is among the hardest things a person can do. You should be proud." Daniel felt pride mixed with the constant awareness that he wasn't doing this alone. Every night, Maisie kept her vigil. Every night, he felt Sarah's presence in the amber eyes watching over their son. The supernatural had become routine, the impossible integrated into daily life. He'd stopped questioning it, stopped trying to prove or disprove it. He simply accepted it as the gift it was, Rebecca had started dating again, mentioned casually that she'd joined an app. "Life keeps moving," she said, half apologetic. "Even when it feels wrong to let it." Daniel understood. He wasn't ready for that yet, might never be ready to try replacing Sarah, but he could feel himself changing, softening, healing in ways that had seemed impossible 4 months ago. Grief would always be present, but it was no longer the only thing he felt. He'd started taking Eli on walks through the neighborhood, pointing out dogs and trees and birds. "Your mum would have loved showing you all this," he'd say. "She had names for all the neighborhood cats, knew all the regulars. She saw magic in ordinary things." He was learning to do the same, to find joy in Eli's laugh, beauty in sunset light through leaves, peace in the small moments that accumulated into a life. On the night of Eli's 6-month birthday, Daniel put his son to bed with extra care, singing the lullaby Sarah had hummed during pregnancy. Eli watched him with increasingly alert eyes, tracking movement, trying to grab at Daniel's face. A person emerging from infant instinct, developing personality and preference. Sarah would have been obsessed with documenting every detail. Daniel took photos instead, creating an archive for when Eli was old enough to want to know his mother. At 2:17 a.m., Daniel woke as he always did. He checked the monitor and saw Maisie in her familiar spot. But something was different. The cat shape looked directly at the camera, amber eyes holding his gaze through the screen. Then, slowly, deliberately, Maisie stood, walked to the side of the crib, and rested her head briefly on the edge, near where Eli's hand was visible, a gesture of tenderness, of benediction. Daniel watched, transfixed, as Maisie walked in a complete circle around the crib, something she'd never done before. At each corner, she paused, as if marking or blessing that spot. When she returned to her starting position, she looked at the camera one final time, and Daniel knew with sudden crushing certainty that this was goodbye. "No," he whispered. "Please, we still need you. I still need you." But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't true. Eli was thriving. Daniel was healing. The acute crisis that had required supernatural intervention had passed. Maisie's job, Sarah's promise, was complete. It was time for whatever came next, whatever form of rest or release spirits required. The amber eyes blinked slowly 3 times, "I love you," in the language Sarah had taught him. Then Maisie's image faded, not abruptly as usual, but gradually, like watercolor dissolving in water. Within 10 seconds, only empty space remained at the foot of Eli's crib. Daniel waited, hoping she might reappear. The 40-second duration passed. 1 minute, 2. The monitor showed only the ordinary nursery, crib, mobile, nightlight, sleeping infant. She was gone. Daniel knew it with the same certainty he'd known about her presence. This wasn't a temporary absence. This was completion. Maisie had watched over Eli through the most vulnerable months, had kept the promise Sarah couldn't keep herself, and now had moved on to whatever came after guardianship was no longer needed. Daniel sat in the darkness of his bedroom and cried, not from grief this time, but from gratitude. For 4 months, he'd been given an impossible gift, proof that love persisted beyond death, that Sarah's essence remained connected to their son, that the wall between the living and the lost was more permeable than despair believed. Maisie's vigil had taught him that he wasn't facing single parenthood entirely alone, that forces he couldn't see or understand were supporting him in ways that mattered. In the morning, Daniel called Rebecca. "She's gone," he said simply. Rebecca understood immediately. "I'm sorry." But Daniel shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. "Don't be. I think it means we're going to be okay. Eli and me. I think that's what she was waiting for, to know we'd survive without constant intervention. It's a graduation, not an abandonment." That week, Daniel did something he'd been avoiding for months. He unpacked the boxes of Sarah's belongings he'd hidden in the garage. Her clothes, her books, the photos and mementos that had been too painful to encounter. He sorted them carefully, keeping some, donating others, creating a memory box for Eli to explore when he was older. Not erasing Sarah from their lives, but integrating her presence in ways that honored rather than paralyzed. He found a photo album Sarah had been making during pregnancy, pages she'd filled with ultrasound images and handwritten notes to their future child. On the last page, dated 2 days before Eli's birth, she'd written, "If anything ever happens to me, know that I will find ways to protect you. Know that love is stronger than whatever tries to separate us. Know that you are my heart walking around outside my body, and hearts don't stop caring just because they stop beating. I promise." Daniel pressed his hand to the page, tears streaming down his face. She'd kept her promise. Through Maisie, through amber eyes on a baby monitor, through impossible nightly appearances that defied every rational framework, she'd kept her promise. And now that promise was fulfilled. Not because the love ended, but because it had accomplished what it needed to accomplish. He hung the photo of Sarah holding Maisie in Eli's nursery, positioned where he could see it during late-night feedings. A reminder of who they'd been, who was watching over them still, even if invisibly now. Some presence didn't require manifestation. Some guardianship operated in silence. Some promises persisted in the structure of ordinary days rather than supernatural interventions. That night, Daniel didn't wake at 2:17. He slept through, deeply and dreamlessly, and woke at 6 when Eli cried for his morning bottle. The monitor showed only normal nursery scenes, no amber eyes, no cat-shaped shadows, no visitors from realms beyond ordinary understanding. Just a baby, healthy and safe and growing, protected by love that took many forms, only some of them visible. Daniel fed his son, talked to him about his mother, about the cat who'd loved her, about the mysterious months when protection came from impossible sources. Eli listened with that intent infant focus, absorbing words he couldn't yet understand but would someday, when Daniel told him the full story of how love had refused to let them be alone. Outside, morning light filled the house with gold, a new day, ordinary and precious. Daniel looked at his son and felt Sarah there, not in supernatural manifestations, but in Eli's expressions, in the shape of his eyes, in the fierce protectiveness Daniel felt surge through him every time he held this tiny person who was half her, half him, entirely himself. Maisie's vigil had ended, but the love that sent her, that would never end. That was eternal. "We're going to be okay," Daniel whispered to Eli, to Sarah, to the universe. "Thank you for showing me that. Thank you for the gift of those 4 months. Thank you for keeping your promise." And though no amber eyes appeared to confirm his words, he felt certain, absolutely certain, that somewhere, somehow she heard him. Life continued. Days accumulated into weeks, weeks into months. Eli grew, Daniel healed, and the memory of Maisie's vigil became a story Daniel would tell his son when he was old enough to understand. A story about love that transcended death, about promises kept through impossible means, about a cat who watched over a baby because the woman who'd loved them both had asked her to. And every so often, in that space between waking and sleeping, Daniel would see amber eyes in his peripheral vision and smile. Not frightened anymore, not even surprised, just grateful for the reminder that the bonds we forge don't break just because circumstances change, that guardians come in many forms, and that love, when fierce enough, finds ways to persist, that science can't explain but hearts understand perfectly. Before you leave, take a moment to hold those you love a little closer. This story reminds us that the bonds we form transcend the boundaries we think separate the living from the lost, that promises made in love have a weight that persists beyond what we can see or measure. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? A moment when you felt a presence, a protection from someone you'd lost. You're not alone, and you're not imagining it. Love finds ways to keep its promises. If this story moved you, Share it with someone who needs to remember that grief and grace can coexist, that the supernatural is sometimes just love refusing to obey the rules we've made about what's possible. Subscribe for more stories that explore the mysterious spaces between loss and comfort, between the explainable and the miraculous. And tonight, when you check on those you're protecting, remember, you might not be the only one watching.